The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed flickered like dying stars, casting shadows that danced across the sterile white walls. I'd been lying here for 3 weeks now, my right leg suspended in traction, my ribs still aching with every breath I took. The accident had changed everything. One moment, I was driving home from my deployment briefing, excited to tell my family about my upcoming assignment overseas, and the next moment, I was trapped in twisted metal, my military career hanging by a thread, just like my broken body. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But the physical pain wasn't what kept me awake at night. It was the silence, the deafening, soul-crushing silence from the one person whose voice I needed to hear most. My father hadn't visited once, not when they brought me in unconscious, not when I woke up screaming from the nightmares, not even when the doctor said I might never walk properly again. The nurses had stopped asking if I was expecting anyone. The empty chair beside my bed had become a monument to disappointment, a daily reminder that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally find conditions after all. My name is Serafina, though everyone in the army called me Sarah. I used to think that name meant something, angel, messenger of God. Now it felt like a cruel joke. What kind of angel ends up broken and alone, abandoned by the very man who gave her that name? I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes in each square for the 1,000th time, when I heard footsteps approaching my room. Heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to someone who'd seen too much of life's cruelties. The door creaked open, and in walked someone I'd never seen before. She was tall, probably in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that held depths of experience I couldn't fathom. Her scrabs were navy blue instead of the usual hospital green, and she carried herself with a confidence that spoke of authority earned through years of service rather than simply given through title. "Good morning, Serafina," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. Southern, maybe, but refined. "I'm Margaret O'Sullivan, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm your new nurse." She set down a chart on the small table beside my bed and pulled up the empty visitor's chair, settling into it like she planned to stay a while. "What happened to Rachel?" I asked, referring to the young nurse who'd been taking care of me since I arrived. Rachel was sweet, barely out of nursing school, with bright eyes that hadn't yet been dimmed by the weight of human suffering. She always tried to cheer me up with stories about her cat or updates about hospital gossip I didn't care about. "Rachel's been reassigned to pediatrics," Maggie replied, checking something on my chart. Apparently, she requested the transfer, said she needed to work with patients who had more hope. The words stung, but I couldn't blame Rachel. I'd been a difficult patient lately, snapping at anyone who tried to offer comfort or encouragement. Hope was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Maggie began her routine checks, but unlike the other nurses, she worked in comfortable silence. She didn't try to fill the air with meaningless chatter or forced optimism. There was something different about her presence, something that made the room feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. When she finished adjusting my IV drip, she didn't immediately leave like the others did. Instead, she sat back down in that chair and studied me with those knowing eyes. "23 years old," she said, reading from my chart, "second lieutenant in the United States Army, scheduled for deployment to Afghanistan before the accident." She looked up at me. "That's quite an accomplishment for someone so young. Your parents must be proud." The mention of parents hit me like a physical blow. I turned my head away, staring out the window at the parking lot below. "My mother died when I was 16, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Breast cancer. And my father, well, let's just say he's not the visiting type." Maggie nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she was letting on. "Tell me about him," she said, simply. Not a question, not a demand, just an invitation to share if I wanted to. I found myself talking before I'd consciously decided to. Maybe it was the pain medication, or maybe it was just the relief of having someone who seemed genuinely interested in listening. "He's a veteran himself, Vietnam, Purple Heart recipient. When I was growing up, he was my hero. He taught me how to shoot, how to fight, how to never give up. He's the reason I joined the military in the first place. I paused, swallowing hard. He used to say that O'Brien women were fighters, that we never back down from a challenge. Guess I'm the exception that proves the rule. What makes you say that? Maggie asked. I gestured weakly at my broken body. Look at me. I can't even get out of bed without help. The doctors say I might have permanent nerve damage in my leg. My military career is over before it really began. I'm everything he taught me never to be. Weak, dependent, broken. Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. I've known a lot of soldiers in my time, Serafina, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that strength isn't measured by whether you can walk or run or carry a 100-pound pack. Real strength is what you do when everything seems hopeless. It's how you face the darkness when there's no light in sight. That's easy to say when you're not the one lying here, I replied bitterly. You're right, she said, surprising me. It is easy to say, but it's a lot harder to live. She stood up and moved to the window, looking down at the parking lot. Your father served in Vietnam, you said? Yeah, 1st Battalion, 25th Infantry Division. He was there during some of the worst fighting. Never talked about it much, but I know he saw things that changed him. I had spent years trying to get him to open up about his service, but he always deflected, changing the subject or finding some excuse to leave the room. Maggie turned back to me, and there was something different in her expression now.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Something that looked almost like recognition. The 25th Infantry. They called them the Tropic Lightning Division. They saw action all over South Vietnam, but particularly heavy fighting in the Iron Triangle and around Cu Chi. She paused. What was your father's name? His full name? James Patrick O'Brien, I replied, wondering why she was asking. But everyone called him Jimmy. Why? The change in Maggie's demeanor was immediate and profound. She went very still, her hand gripping the windowsill until her knuckles turned white. When she turned back to face me, there were tears in her eyes that she was fighting to control. Sweet Jesus, she whispered. Jimmy O'Brien, I should have seen it in your face. You have his eyes. You knew my father? The words came out as barely a whisper. In all my 23 years, I'd never met anyone who knew him from Vietnam. He'd always said that most of the guys he served with didn't make it home, and the ones who did scattered to the four winds, trying to forget what they'd been through. Maggie sat down heavily in the chair, her professional composure cracking. Knew him? Honey, your father saved my brother's life. Hell, he saved my whole family. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. My brother Danny was in Jimmy's squad. This was back in '69, during the Tet Offensive. Their patrol got pinned down by enemy fire in a village outside Saigon. Danny had taken shrapnel to the chest and couldn't move. The rest of the squad was trapped, and the enemy was closing in. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My father had never told me any specific stories about his combat experience. I knew he'd been decorated, but he always brushed off my questions with vague responses about doing his duty and looking out for his fellow soldiers. Your father could have stayed in cover, Maggie continued, her voice growing stronger as she talked. It would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing, but he didn't. He crawled through enemy fire, through mud and chaos and hell itself to get to Danny. He dragged him to safety, then went back for 2 other wounded soldiers. The medic said Danny wouldn't have lasted another 10 minutes if Jimmy hadn't acted when he did. The room seemed to spin around me. This heroic figure she was describing bore no resemblance to the distant, cold man who couldn't even be bothered to visit his own daughter in the hospital. Are you sure we're talking about the same person? I asked, because the Jimmy O'Brien I know isn't exactly the heroic type anymore. Maggie's expression softened with understanding. War changes people, Serafina. Sometimes it brings out the best in them, and sometimes it buries that goodness so deep they forget it ever existed. Your father came home different, didn't he? More withdrawn, harder to reach? I nodded, thinking about all the times I'd tried to connect with him over the years. The way he'd disappear for hours without explanation, the nights I'd hear him pacing the floor or shouting in his sleep, the gradual way he'd built walls around himself that got higher and stronger with each passing year. After Mom died, those walls became nearly impenetrable. Danny used to write to us about Jimmy, Maggie said, about how he looked out for everyone in the squad, how he'd share his rations with guys who'd lost theirs, how he'd volunteer for the most dangerous patrols to keep the younger soldiers safe. He was a natural leader, someone the other men trusted with their lives. But Danny also wrote about the nightmares, about how Jimmy would wake up screaming, about the way he'd get this 1,000-yard stare sometimes, like he was seeing ghosts. What happened to Danny? I asked, though something in Maggie's tone suggested I might not want to know the answer. He made it through Vietnam, she said quietly. Your father's actions bought him the time he needed to heal from his wounds. But the war followed him home, just like it followed Jimmy. Danny struggled with what we now know was PTSD, though back then they just called it shell shock or battle fatigue. He self-medicated with alcohol and drugs, couldn't hold down a job, couldn't maintain relationships. He died in 1987 from an overdose. The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I thought about my father's drinking, the way he'd sometimes disappear into his workshop for days at a time, emerging hollow-eyed and exhausted. I'd always attributed his distance to grief over Mom's death, but maybe it went much deeper than that. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. I'm sorry about Danny, and I'm sorry that my father's heroism couldn't save him from what came after. Don't you dare apologize for your father, Maggie said sharply, her voice carrying an edge of steel. Jimmy O'Brien gave my family 8 more years with Danny, 8 years of laughter and love and memories that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Yes, Danny struggled, and yes, we lost him eventually, but that doesn't diminish what your father did or who he was in those moments when it mattered most. I wanted to argue, to point out that heroic moments in a foreign war didn't excuse a lifetime of emotional absence, but something in Maggie's fierce defense of my father stopped me. She had known a version of him that I'd never seen, a man capable of extraordinary courage and selflessness. The question that haunted me was whether that man still existed somewhere beneath the layers of pain and withdrawal, or if he died in those Vietnamese jungles along with so many others. Why do you think he won't come see me? I asked, the question that had been eating away at me for weeks finally spilling out. I'm his only child. I almost died in that accident. Even if he doesn't love me anymore, you'd think basic human decency would compel him to at least check if I'm alive. Maggie was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Can I tell you something about trauma, Serafina? Something I learned from years of working with veterans and their families? When I nodded, she continued, sometimes the people we love most become too precious to risk losing. And sometimes, when someone's been through enough loss, enough pain, they'll push away the people who matter most rather than risk experiencing that kind of devastation again. That doesn't make sense, I protested. If he loves me, he should want to be here. Should, yes, but love and fear don't always follow logic. Your father lost friends in Vietnam, watched good men die in his arms. He came home to find a country that didn't understand or appreciate his sacrifice. Then he lost your mother, the love of his life, to cancer. In his mind, everyone he's ever cared about has either died or been taken from him. Maybe he thinks that if he keeps his distance, if he doesn't let himself need you too much, it won't hurt as badly when he inevitably loses you too. The idea was both heartbreaking and infuriating. But I'm not dead, I said. I'm right here, and I need him. I know you are, honey. And somewhere deep down, I think he knows that too. But trauma isn't rational. It's a beast that feeds on fear and grows stronger in isolation. Your father's been feeding that beast for over 40 years. As if summoned by our conversation, there was a commotion in the hallway outside my room. Raised voices, the sound of someone arguing with the nursing staff. My heart jumped as I recognized one of the voices, even though it had been months since I'd heard it. Maggie must have heard it too, because she stood up and moved toward the door. Excuse me, sir, but visiting hours don't start until... I don't give a damn about visiting hours. That's my daughter in there, and I need to see her, now. The door burst open, and there stood my father, looking older and more haggard than I remembered. His gray hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild, darting around the room until they landed on me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, across the gulf that had grown between us over the years. "Jimmy," Maggie said softly, and my father's head snapped toward her. The change in his expression was immediate and profound. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked like shame. "Maggie Sullivan," he said, his voice barely audible. Jesus Christ, I didn't know. I didn't think. He seemed to struggle for words, his usual gruff demeanor cracking like ice in spring. "It's O'Sullivan now," she corrected gently. "I got married. But yes, it's me, Danny's sister." My father's face went white, and he reached out blindly for support, his hand finding the doorframe. "Danny," he whispered. "How is Danny?" The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Maggie's face as she struggled with how to respond, and I knew instinctively that she was about to deliver news that would shatter whatever fragile equilibrium my father had managed to maintain over the years. "Danny died, Jimmy. 20 years ago. I'm sorry." The sound that came from my father wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a scream. It was the sound of a soul breaking, of carefully constructed defenses crumbling all at once. He slumped against the doorframe, his body shaking with the force of his grief. "I should have kept in touch," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I should have found him, helped him, done something. I saved his life over there, and then I abandoned him. I abandoned everyone." "No," Maggie said firmly, crossing to him and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You didn't abandon anyone. You came home broken, just like he did, just like all of you did. There's no shame in that." "There's shame in running away," my father replied, his eyes finding mine across the room. "There's shame in leaving your family when they need you most." He straightened up with visible effort and walked slowly toward my bed, each step seeming to cost him tremendous effort. When he reached my bedside, he stopped and just looked at me for a long moment. Up close, I could see how much he'd aged, how much weight he'd lost. There were new lines around his eyes, deeper grooves in his face. He looked like a man who'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for too long. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said finally, using the nickname he hadn't called me since I was a child. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I've been such a coward." "Dad," I started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I need to say this while I still can." He took a shaky breath. "When your mother died, something broke inside me. Something that I thought was already as broken as it could get. I couldn't bear the thought of losing anyone else, so I started pushing everyone away, especially you." "Why especially me?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Because you're the most like her," he said simply. "Not just in looks, though God knows you have her eyes and her smile, but in spirit, in the way you approach life with this fierce determination and endless capacity for love. Watching you grow up was like having Sarah back again, and losing you, I knew losing you would kill me." "But you didn't lose me," I pointed out. "I'm right here." "I know that now," he said. "But when I got the call about your accident, when they told me you might not make it," his voice broke and he had to stop and compose himself. "All I could think about was Vietnam, about watching my friends die, about holding your mother's hand as the cancer took her away piece by piece. I couldn't face the possibility of sitting in another hospital room, watching someone I love slip away. The anger I'd been carrying for weeks began to ebb, replaced by a sadness so profound it took my breath away. Here was my father, the man I'd always seen as invincible, revealing the depths of his vulnerability and fear. He wasn't the cold, unfeeling man I'd imagined. He was a wounded soul who'd been running from his demons for so long he'd forgotten how to stand and fight. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad," I said, reaching out to take his hand. His skin was rough and calloused from years of manual labor, but his grip was gentle, almost tentative, as if he was afraid I might disappear if he held on too tightly. "You don't know that," he replied. "None of us know what's coming." "You're right," I admitted. "I don't know what the future holds. The doctors say I might have permanent damage, that I might never be able to serve overseas like I planned. But I do know this. Running away from the people who love us doesn't protect us from loss. It just guarantees that we'll be alone when the worst happens." Maggie, who had been quietly observing our reunion, stepped forward. "Jimmy, can I tell you something about your daughter? Something I learned in just the few hours I've been taking care of her." My father nodded, his eyes not leaving my face. "She's got your courage," Maggie said. "Maybe not the same kind you showed in Vietnam, but courage nonetheless. The kind it takes to choose hope over despair, love over fear. The kind it takes to keep fighting even when everything seems lost." "I don't feel very courageous," I admitted. "I feel broken and scared and angry." "Feeling those things doesn't make you weak," Maggie replied. "It makes you human. Your father felt all those same things in Vietnam, and he still managed to be a hero when it mattered most." "I was different then," my father said quietly. "Younger, more naive. I believed in things that I'm not sure exist anymore." "Like what?" I asked. "Like the idea that good people could make a difference, that courage and honor meant something, that there was such a thing as a just cause worth fighting for." He shook his head sadly. "Vietnam taught me that the world is more complicated and cruel than I'd ever imagined, and losing your mother taught me that sometimes no amount of fighting or courage or determination can save the people you love most." "But you did save people," Maggie interjected. "You saved Danny. You saved those other soldiers. Just because you couldn't save everyone doesn't diminish what you accomplished." "Did I save them?" my father asked bitterly. "Danny's dead. Those other boys, I don't even know what happened to them. For all I know, they came home and fell apart just like the rest of us." "One of them didn't," Maggie said quietly, and something in her tone made both my father and me turn to look at her. "Michael Torres. Do you remember him?" My father's face went pale. "Mickey? Little Mickey Torres from San Antonio? He was just a kid, barely 18. Took shrapnel in his shoulder when we got ambushed near the Michelin plantation." "He's Dr. Michael Torres now," Maggie said with a small smile. "Chief of surgery at Houston Methodist. Married, 3 kids, 2 grandkids. He credits you with saving not just his life, but giving him the inspiration to become a doctor. Said he wanted to save lives the way you saved his." The impact of her words was visible on my father's face. For the first time since he'd entered the room, some of the weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. "Mickey became a doctor?" "One of the best in Texas, from what I hear. He does volunteer work with veteran support groups, helps soldiers transitioning back to civilian life. He's touched hundreds of lives over the years, maybe thousands, all because you dragged him out of that hell and gave him a chance to become the man he was meant to be." I watched my father process this information, saw the way it challenged the narrative he'd been telling himself for decades. He'd been so focused on the people he couldn't save, the battles he couldn't win, that he'd lost sight of the victories that mattered most. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "Because Mickey and I have been in touch over the years. When Danny died, Mickey reached out to our family. He'd been looking for you, wanting to thank you properly, but you'd moved and changed jobs so many times after the war that he could never track you down. He asked me to let him know if I ever found you." My father was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "All these years, I thought I'd failed them all." "You didn't fail anyone, Dad," I said firmly. "You survived. You came home. You raised me, even if it wasn't perfect. You gave me the strength and determination that got me through basic training, through officer candidate school, through everything that brought me to where I am today." "Look where that got you," he said, gesturing at my broken leg. "It got me to exactly where I'm supposed to be," I replied, with a certainty that surprised me. "Right here, right now, having this conversation with you. If I hadn't enlisted, if I hadn't been driving to that deployment briefing, if I hadn't had this accident, we might never have found our way back to each other." The truth of those words settled over all 3 of us like a benediction. Sometimes,
the worst things that happen to us become the catalysts for the healing we didn't even know we needed. My accident, as traumatic and life-changing as it had forced both my father and me to confront the walls we'd built between us. "There's something else," Maggie said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Something I need to tell both of you." She paused, as if gathering her courage. "I didn't end up as your nurse by accident, Serafina. When I saw your name on the patient roster, when I realized who you were, I requested the transfer from the cardiac unit. I needed to meet Jimmy O'Brien's daughter." "Why?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because I owe your family a debt I can never fully repay. Not just for what Jimmy did for Danny, though that would be enough, but for what both of you represent. The idea that heroism isn't just about grand gestures or moments of glory. Sometimes it's about showing up, day after day, even when you're broken, even when you're scared."
Even when you don't feel like a hero at all. She turned to my father. "Jimmy, you spent years blaming yourself for not being able to save everyone, for not being the perfect soldier or the perfect father or the perfect husband. But perfection was never the point. The point was that you tried. The point was that when it mattered most, you found the courage to act. And Serafina," she continued, turning back to me, "you've been lying in this bed for weeks, thinking you're weak because you can't walk properly, because your military career might be over, because your father wasn't here to support you. But strength isn't about what you can do with your body. It's about what you choose to do with your spirit. And from where I stand, both of you have spirits that refuse to be broken, no matter what life throws at you." The three of us sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, painting the room in warm golden hues. For the first time since my accident, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: peace. "Dad," I said finally, "what happens now? Where do we go from here?" He squeezed my hand gently, his grip steady and sure, for the first time in as long as I could remember. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know we'll figure it out together. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I'm done running." "Good," I said, smiling through the tears I hadn't realized were falling. "Because I'm going to need help with physical therapy, and I hear you're pretty good at not giving up when things get tough." "Where did you hear that?" he asked, with a ghost of his old humor. "From someone who knew you when you were young and fearless," I replied, glancing at Maggie. "Before you forgot that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." My father followed my gaze to Maggie, and I saw something pass between them, a shared understanding, born of loss and resilience, of lives touched by war and shaped by survival. "Thank you," he said to her, "for taking care of my daughter, for telling me about Mickey, for reminding me that there's still good in this world worth fighting for." "Thank you," Maggie replied, "for giving my family 8 more years with Danny, for showing a scared kid from Chicago that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to, and for raising a daughter who embodies the very best of who you used to be and who you can be again." As the evening wore on, the three of us talked about everything and nothing. My father shared stories from Vietnam that he'd never told anyone, including tales of Mickey Torres and the other young men he'd served with. Maggie told us about her years as a nurse, about the soldiers she'd cared for who reminded her of her brother, about the ways she'd tried to honor Danny's memory through her work. And I talked about my own dreams and fears, about the young woman I'd been before the accident and the person I was still becoming. We talked about Mom, about the ways her death had broken us and the ways her memory still held us together. We talked about forgiveness, not just forgiving each other, but forgiving ourselves for being human, for being flawed, for not being able to save everyone we love. By the time visiting hours officially ended, something fundamental had shifted in the room. The distance that had separated my father and me for so many years had been bridged by honesty, by pain shared rather than hidden, by the recognition that our individual traumas had been isolating us from the very connections we needed most to heal. "I'll be back tomorrow," my father promised as he prepared to leave, "and the day after that, and every day until you're ready to come home." "Home," I repeated, tasting the word. It had felt like such an abstract concept for so long, a place I'd left behind when I joined the military,
a childhood memory that no longer seemed to apply to my adult life. But maybe home wasn't a place at all. Maybe it was simply being known and accepted by the people who loved you, flaws and all. Home, my father confirmed, and in that single word, I heard an invitation, a promise, and a new beginning all rolled into one. After he left, Maggie helped me settle in for the night, adjusting my pillows and checking my medication levels. But instead of rushing off to her next patient like the other nurses did, she sat back down in the visitor's chair. "How are you feeling?" she asked, and I knew she wasn't talking about my physical condition. "Different," I said honestly. "Hopeful, maybe, for the first time in weeks, but also scared. What if we can't maintain this? What if we fall back into old patterns?" "Then you'll work through it," she said simply. "Healing isn't a straight line, Serafina. It's a journey with setbacks and breakthroughs, with days when you feel strong and days when you feel like you're starting over from scratch. The key is not giving up on each other when things get difficult." "Is that what happened with Danny?" I asked gently. "Did your family give up on him?" Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. "We tried," she said finally. "God knows we tried. But back then, we didn't understand PTSD the way we do now. We kept thinking that love and support would be enough to heal him, that if we just tried harder or said the right things, we could bring back the brother who'd gone to war. We didn't realize that the brother who came back wasn't broken, he was changed. And instead of accepting and loving the person he'd become, we kept mourning the person he used to be. Do you think things would have been different if you'd understood that then? Maybe, maybe not. Danny had demons that went beyond what any family could address. But I think we could have made his journey easier if we'd focused on walking alongside him instead of dragging him back to a place that no longer existed." Her words resonated deeply with me as I thought about my father's own journey, about the ways I'd spent years trying to recapture the relationship we had when I was a child, instead of building something new based on who we both were now. Perhaps that had been part of the problem. We'd both been so focused on what we'd lost that we couldn't see what we still had. "Maggie," I said as she prepared to leave, "why did you really request this transfer? I mean, I understand wanting to meet Jimmy O'Brien's daughter, but there had to be more to it than that." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Because I needed to believe that some stories have happy endings. I've spent 20 years wondering what happened to the man who saved my brother's life, whether he'd found peace or whether he'd been consumed by the same darkness that took Danny. Meeting you, seeing the woman he raised despite his struggles, knowing that there's still a chance for both of you to heal, it gives me hope that Danny's sacrifice meant something after all. His sacrifice. Every soldier who comes home, changed by war, makes a sacrifice, even if they survive. They sacrifice the innocence they had before, the easy faith in simple answers, the luxury of not knowing how cruel the world can be. Danny sacrificed those things, and so did your father. The question is whether that sacrifice leads to wisdom and compassion, or to bitterness and isolation. And which do you think it's led to for my father?" "I think it's led to both," she said honestly, "but I also think it's not too late for the wisdom and compassion to win out. Tonight was a start. The rest is up to both of you." After she left, I lay in the darkness thinking about everything that had happened, about the strange series of coincidences that had brought Maggie into my life at exactly the moment when I needed to hear her stories about my father's heroism.
Some people might call it fate or divine intervention. I prefer to think of it as grace, the idea that sometimes, when we're at our lowest point, the universe conspires to remind us that we're not alone, that our lives are connected in ways we can't always see or understand. My father had saved Danny Sullivan's life in a Vietnamese jungle over 50 years ago. That act of courage had rippled forward through time, touching not just Danny's family, but eventually leading to this moment, this conversation, this chance for healing that neither my father nor I had dared to hope for. In saving Danny, my father had unknowingly planted the seeds of his own redemption, though it would take decades for them to bloom. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the long road ahead, the physical therapy that would determine whether I could return to military service, the emotional work my father and I would need to do to rebuild our relationship, the ways we would both need to learn to live with uncertainty and embrace the possibility of hope. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and moments of doubt, times when the old patterns of distance and self-protection would reassert themselves. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't facing that future alone. And for the first time in years, my father wasn't running from his past. We had found each other again, not in spite of our brokenness, but because of it. Not despite our fears, but by walking through them together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations that needed to be had, new steps on the journey toward healing. But tonight, in this sterile hospital room that had become the unlikely setting for a miracle, I was simply grateful. Grateful for Maggie's wisdom and compassion, grateful for my father's courage in facing his demons, grateful for the reminder that sometimes our greatest strengths emerge from our deepest wounds. The fluorescent lights above my bed had stopped flickering, casting steady light across the room. The empty visitor's chair was no longer a symbol of... The morning light streaming through my hospital window carried a different quality than it had in weeks past. Where once it had seemed harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every flaw and limitation of my confined existence, now it felt almost gentle, like a warm embrace from an old friend. I had awakened before the usual flurry of morning rounds, my body's internal clock finally syncing with something other than pain medication schedules and visiting hours that never brought visitors. My father had kept his promise. He'd return the next day and the day after that, each visit building upon the foundation we'd laid during that first emotional reunion with Maggie. The conversations weren't always easy. Decades of distance and misunderstanding couldn't be erased overnight, but we were learning to navigate the complicated terrain of our shared history with something approaching grace. Today marked exactly 1 month since my accident, and Dr. Patel had scheduled a comprehensive evaluation to determine the extent of my recovery and what my future might hold. The possibility of permanent nerve damage still loomed over everything, casting shadows on dreams I'd harbored since childhood, of serving my country overseas, of following in my father's footsteps in ways that mattered. I was practicing the physical therapy exercises Maggie had taught me when I heard familiar voices in the hallway. My father's distinctive baritone mixed with another voice I didn't recognize, someone with a slight accent that sounded vaguely familiar. The conversation seemed animated, punctuated by laughter that I hadn't heard from my father in years. When the door opened, my father entered, followed by a man I'd never seen before. He was probably in his early 70s, with silver hair neatly combed and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Despite his age, he carried himself with the straight-backed posture of someone who had served in the military, and there was something about his presence that commanded respect without demanding it. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet someone very special," my father said, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard since I was a child. "This is Dr. Michael Torres." The name hit me like a physical blow. Mickey Torres, the young soldier my father had saved in Vietnam, the boy who had grown up to become one of Texas's most respected surgeons. I found myself staring at this distinguished gentleman, trying to reconcile him with the teenager my father and Maggie had described. Dr. Torres approached my bed with a warm smile, extending his hand in greeting. "It's an honor to finally meet Jimmy O'Brien's daughter," he said, his voice carrying traces of his San Antonio roots despite the decades of education and professional refinement. "Your father has been telling me about your accident and your recovery. I hope you don't mind, but I asked if I could take a look at your medical records." "You asked?" I looked between him and my father, confusion evident in my voice. "I called him," my father admitted, his cheeks coloring slightly. "After Maggie told me about Mickey becoming a doctor, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent 3 days trying to work up the courage to reach out, and when I finally did..." He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. "When he finally did," Dr. Torres continued, "I dropped everything and drove here immediately. I've been trying to find your father for over 30 years. When Maggie told me she'd finally located him, I thought it was too good to be true." 30 years? I repeated weakly. Dr. Torres pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down, his professional demeanor softening into something more personal. "Your father probably doesn't remember this, but when I was lying in that field hospital in Vietnam, delirious with fever and infection, I made him a promise. I told him that if I lived, I would spend the rest of my life trying to save people the way he had saved me. At the time, I thought I might become a medic or maybe a paramedic. I never imagined I'd end up in medical school, let alone become a surgeon." "What changed?" I asked. "Your father did," Dr. Torres replied simply. "Not just the act of saving my life, though that was certainly part of it.
It was the way he talked to me during those long nights in the hospital, when the pain was so bad I wanted to give up. He told me about his dreams for after the war, about the daughter he wanted to have someday, about the kind of father he wanted to be. He talked about honor and duty not as abstract concepts, but as daily choices, as ways of living that could give meaning to even the most senseless suffering. I glanced at my father, seeing him through Dr. Torres's eyes, a young man full of hopes and dreams, rather than the weary, withdrawn figure I'd grown up with. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring to realize how much the war had cost him, how many pieces of himself he'd left behind in those Vietnamese jungles. He told me that the point wasn't to be fearless, Dr. Torres continued, but to act with courage despite the fear. He said that everyone gets scared, everyone faces moments when they want to quit, but that character is revealed in what we choose to do when quitting would be easier than continuing. I remember that conversation, my father said quietly. You were running a high fever, and the medics weren't sure you were going to make it through the night. I was trying to keep you awake, keep you fighting. You did more than that, Dr. Torres replied. You gave me a philosophy to live by. When medical school got overwhelming, when I was working 36-hour shifts as a resident, when I faced my first unsuccessful surgery and wanted to quit, I heard your voice telling me that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about pushing through the fear to do what needed to be done. The weight of his words settled over the room like a benediction. Here was living proof that my father's actions in Vietnam had rippled forward through time in ways he'd never imagined, touching not just Dr. Torres's life, but the lives of everyone he'd treated and saved over his decades-long career. I've brought something for you, Dr. Torres said to my father, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a faded photograph, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. This is from the field hospital, about a week after you pulled me out of that village. I kept it all these years, hoping someday I'd be able to return it to you along with my thanks. My father took the photograph with trembling hands, and I could see tears gathering in his eyes as he studied the image. It showed a group of wounded soldiers, all of them young and broken, but somehow still managing to smile for the camera. In the center, my father sat with his arm around a thin, pale young man who had to be Dr. Torres. Look how young we were, my father whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Not stupid, Dr. Torres corrected gently.
Naive, maybe, but not stupid. We believed we could make a difference, that our sacrifices would matter. And we were right, even if it took decades to understand how. Mickey, my father said, using the old nickname, I need to tell you something. When Maggie told me you'd become a doctor, that you'd built this amazing life and career, I was happy for you, but I was also eaten up with guilt. Guilt? For what? For not staying in touch, for not being there when you needed support transitioning back to civilian life, for letting you down when it mattered most. Dr. Torres shook his head firmly. Jimmy, you didn't let me down. You gave me exactly what I needed when I needed it most. After that, it was up to me to take the foundation you'd provided and build something meaningful on top of it. That's not abandonment, that's trust. Trust that the lessons you taught me were strong enough to carry me through whatever came next. But so many others didn't make it, my father replied, his voice heavy with the weight of survivor's guilt. Danny Sullivan, Tony Rodriguez, that kid from Minnesota whose name I can never remember. They came home broken, and they never found their way back. And that's tragic, Dr. Torres acknowledged, but their struggles don't diminish what you accomplished, or what you meant to those of us who did find our way. You can't save everyone, Jimmy. No one can. But that doesn't mean the lives you do save matter any less. I watched this exchange with growing understanding of the burden my father had been carrying all these years. He'd been measuring his worth not by the lives he'd saved, but by the ones he couldn't save. Not by the good he'd accomplished, but by the tragedies he'd been powerless to prevent. It was a standard no human being could meet, a weight that would crush anyone who tried to carry it alone. Dr. Torres, I said, interrupting their conversation, can I ask you something? When you came home from Vietnam, how did you deal with the transition? How did you move forward when everything felt broken? He turned to me with the kind of attention that made it clear he understood this wasn't idle curiosity. That's a complicated question with a complicated answer. The short version is that I didn't handle it well at first.
I struggled with nightmares, with anger, with feeling disconnected from everyone around me who hadn't experienced what we'd been through. I started drinking too much, isolating myself, pushing away anyone who tried to help. What changed? Several things, but the most important was meeting my wife, Elena. She was a social worker who specialized in helping veterans, and she had this way of seeing through all my defenses to the person I was underneath the trauma. She didn't try to fix me or change me. She just accepted that I was different from who I'd been before the war and loved me anyway. I glanced at my father, wondering if he'd ever found that kind of acceptance, that kind of unconditional love that could heal the deepest wounds. Elena taught me that healing isn't about returning to who you were before, Dr. Torres continued. It's about integrating your experiences, both good and bad, into a new version of yourself. The boy who went to Vietnam died in that jungle, and that was okay. The man who came back was different, scarred, changed, but he was also stronger and more compassionate and more aware of what really mattered in life. Your mother tried to tell me the same thing, my father said quietly. After I came home, when I was struggling to adjust, she used to say that she hadn't fallen in love with the man I used to be. She'd fallen in love with the man I was becoming, scars and all. But you didn't believe her? I couldn't, he admitted. I was so focused on everything I'd lost, everything I could no longer do or be, that I couldn't see what I'd gained. The capacity for deeper empathy, the understanding of how precious and fragile life really is, the knowledge that every day we're given is a gift that shouldn't be wasted on petty concerns or grudges. Dr. Torres nodded knowingly. It took me years to understand that my experiences in Vietnam, as traumatic as they were, had given me something invaluable as a surgeon. I understood suffering in a way that doctors who'd never been through trauma couldn't. I could sit with patients and their families in their darkest moments and offer genuine comfort because I knew what it felt like to face the possibility of death, to feel hopeless and scared and alone. Is that why you chose surgery specifically? I asked. Partly, but also because surgery is about precision under pressure, about making life or death decisions in moments when there's no time for doubt or hesitation. The skills I'd learned in combat, staying calm in chaos, thinking clearly under fire, trusting my training even when everything seemed to be falling apart, translated perfectly to the operating room. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Maggie entered carrying a chart and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she had good news to share. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what kind of reunion she was walking in on. "Not at all," Dr. Torres replied, standing to greet her. "Maggie O'Sullivan, after all these years, you look exactly the same." "Flatter," she replied, but I could see she was pleased. "Though I have to say, becoming one of the most respected surgeons in Texas suits you, Mickey Torres." "It's all thanks to the foundation your family and Jimmy here gave me," he said seriously. "The letters Danny sent, the stories he told about home, the reminder that there was still good in the world worth fighting for. All of that kept me going during the darkest times." Maggie's expression softened with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Danny would be so proud to see what you've accomplished. He always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself." "Speaking of accomplishments," Dr. Torres said, turning back to me, "I've been reviewing your medical records, and I have some thoughts about your treatment plan that I'd like to discuss with Dr. Patel." "What kind of thoughts?" I asked, not sure if I wanted to hear the answer. "The kind that suggest your prognosis might be more optimistic than your current medical team believes. The nerve damage you sustained is significant, but it's not necessarily permanent. There are some newer surgical techniques, some experimental treatments that might help restore full function to your leg." I felt my heart skip a beat. "Are you saying I might be able to return to active duty?" "I'm saying it's a possibility worth exploring. But I want to be clear, even if these treatments don't work, even if you can't return to the military career you'd planned, that doesn't mean your life is over or that you can't find new ways to serve your country and your community." "What do you mean?" Dr. Torres sat back down, his expression thoughtful. "When I realized I couldn't return to combat, I felt like my life was over. I'd defined myself entirely by my role as a soldier, and without that identity, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. It took me a long time to understand that service comes in many forms. that there are countless ways to make a difference in the world. Like becoming a surgeon.
Like becoming a surgeon, yes, but also like becoming a teacher, a counselor, an advocate for other veterans, a mentor for young people facing your own challenges. The skills you've developed in the military, leadership, discipline, the ability to perform under pressure, the commitment to something larger than yourself, those skills are transferable to almost any field. My father leaned forward in his chair. What Mickey is trying to say is that your worth isn't determined by your job or your physical capabilities. It's determined by the choices you make, the values you uphold, the impact you have on the lives of others. Easy to say when you're not the one facing the end of everything you'd planned for your future, I replied, though without the bitterness that would have colored those words just weeks earlier. You're right, my father admitted. It is easy to say. But I've spent the last 30 years learning the hard way that fighting against reality is a losing battle. The question isn't whether your life is going to be different than you planned. The question is whether you're going to let that difference destroy you or transform you. Dr. Torres nodded in agreement. When I was lying in that field hospital, convinced that my life was over, your father told me something I've never forgotten. He said that our biggest disasters often become doorways to our greatest opportunities, but only if we're brave enough to walk through them instead of running away. Did I really say that? My father asked, looking surprised. You did, and you were right. My injury, as painful and frightening as it was, forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about myself and my future. It pushed me toward medicine, toward a career that has been more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined as an 18-year-old kid from San Antonio. Maggie, who had been listening quietly to this exchange, stepped forward with my chart. Speaking of medical careers and new opportunities, I have some test results that might interest everyone. Good news or bad news? I asked, bracing myself for another setback. Cautiously optimistic news, she replied with a smile. Your latest nerve conduction studies show significant improvement over the past week. Whatever you've been doing differently, the physical therapy, the improved emotional state, the presence of family support, it's working. I felt tears spring to my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, they were tears of relief rather than frustration or despair. Does this mean I might recover full function? It means the possibility is much more realistic than we initially thought, Maggie replied carefully. Dr. Patel wants to schedule some additional tests, and with Dr. Torres's input on potential treatment options, I think we can develop a comprehensive plan that maximizes your chances of full recovery. Dr. Torres stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. When he turned back to face us, his expression was serious but hopeful. I want to propose something, but I need you to promise you'll consider it carefully before giving me an answer. What kind of proposal? My father asked suspiciously. I'd like Serafina to consider transferring to Houston Methodist for her continued treatment. We have some of the most advanced rehabilitation facilities in the country, and I can personally oversee her care. More importantly, I have contacts with military medical personnel who specialize in helping service members return to active duty after significant injuries. The room fell silent as we all processed this offer. The idea of leaving the familiar surroundings of this hospital, of saying goodbye to Maggie and the other staff members who had become like family over the past month, was daunting. But the possibility of receiving cutting-edge treatment that might restore my military career was incredibly tempting. There's something else, Dr. Torres continued. Elena and I have talked extensively about this, and we'd like to invite you and your father to stay with us during your treatment. We have a large house with guest accommodations, and Elena has experience helping families navigate the challenges of recovery from traumatic injuries. That's incredibly generous, I said, overwhelmed by the offer, but I couldn't impose on you like that. It wouldn't be an imposition, Dr. Torres replied firmly. It would be an honor. Your father saved my life over 50 years ago. Helping his daughter recover from her injuries isn't a burden. It's the completion of a circle, the fulfillment of a debt I've been carrying for decades. I looked at my father, trying to read his expression. The idea of leaving familiar territory for an uncertain future in Houston had to be as frightening for him as it was for me, especially given his tendency to retreat from challenging situations.
"What do you think, Dad?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Dr. Torres and me. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "I think we should do it. I think we should take the chance." "Are you sure? It would mean leaving everything familiar behind, starting over in a new place with new doctors and new routines." "Sarah," he said, reaching out to take my hand, "I've spent the last 20 years of my life running away from chances, avoiding risks, choosing the safe path even when it led nowhere. I'm done living that way. If Mickey thinks he can help you get your life back, then we're going to Houston." The determination in his voice surprised me. This wasn't the hesitant, withdrawn man I'd grown up with. This was someone who had rediscovered his capacity for courage, for taking action when action was needed. "Besides," he continued, with a ghost of a smile, "someone once told me that our biggest disasters often become doorways to our greatest opportunities. Maybe it's time I started taking my own advice." Dr. Torres grinned, and for a moment I could see the young soldier he'd once been, full of hope and determination despite the challenges he faced. "In that case, I'll start making arrangements immediately. I want to get you transferred within the next week if possible." "That soon?" I asked, sudden panic rising in my throat. "The sooner we begin intensive treatment, the better your chances of full recovery," he explained gently. "But I understand this is overwhelming. If you need more time to consider—" "No," I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness of my own voice. "You're right. If we're going to do this, we should do it properly. I'm tired of half measures and cautious optimism. I want to fight for my future with everything I've got." Maggie stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "For what it's worth, I think you're making the right decision. Dr. Torres has resources and expertise that we simply can't match here. And more importantly, you'll have the support of people who understand what you're going through in ways that go beyond medical textbooks and treatment protocols." "What about you?" I asked her. "I can't imagine going through this recovery without you." "Oh, sweetheart," she said, with tears in her eyes, "you're not getting rid of me that easily. Dr. Torres and I have already discussed the possibility of my taking a temporary assignment at Houston Methodist to help with your transition. If you're comfortable with that arrangement, I'll be there to support you every step of the way."
The relief that washed over me at her words was almost overwhelming. Maggie had become more than just my nurse over these past weeks. She'd been my advocate, my counselor, my connection to a part of my father's history I'd never known existed. The thought of facing an uncertain future without her guidance and support had been one of my biggest concerns about the transfer. "There's one more thing I'd like to discuss," Dr. Torres said, his tone becoming more serious. "Elena and I have been involved with a support group for military families dealing with trauma and recovery. It's not traditional therapy, but it's a space where people can share their experiences with others who truly understand what they're going through." "You mean group therapy?" my father asked, his old defensiveness creeping back into his voice. "I mean community," Dr. Torres replied gently. "People who've walked similar paths, who can offer practical advice and emotional support without judgment. Veterans from different eras, different conflicts, different branches of service, all united by the common experience of having served their country and paid a price for that service." "I don't know," my father said hesitantly. "I've never been much for talking about personal things with strangers." "Neither was I," Dr. Torres admitted. "For years, I kept my Vietnam experiences locked away, convinced that no one could possibly understand what I'd been through. It was only when I met other veterans who'd faced similar challenges that I realized how much healing could come from simply being heard and understood by people who'd walked similar paths." "What kind of people are in this group?" I asked, curious despite my own reservations about group settings. "All kinds. There's Maria, a Navy corpsman who served in Iraq and is now a physical therapist specializing in treating other veterans. There's Robert, an Air Force pilot from the Gulf War who became a counselor after struggling with PTSD. There's Jennifer, an Army medic from Afghanistan who's now in medical school, inspired by the doctors who saved her life after an IED explosion." The pattern he was describing was striking. People who had transformed their trauma into purpose, who had found ways to use their painful experiences as foundations for helping others. It was exactly what Dr. Torres himself had done, and exactly what Maggie was doing by dedicating her career to caring for patients who reminded her of her lost brother. The point isn't to dwell on the past or to wallow in shared misery, Dr. Torres continued. It's to learn from each other, to share strategies for coping and healing, to celebrate victories and support each other through setbacks. It's about understanding that your struggles don't define you, but they can inform the person you choose to become. I looked at my father, seeing him wrestle with decades of ingrained reluctance to show vulnerability or ask for help. The man who had once crawled through enemy fire to save wounded soldiers had somehow learned to see seeking emotional support as a sign of weakness rather than strength. "Dad," I said gently, "remember what you told Dr. Torres in that field hospital? About courage being what you do despite the fear?" He nodded slowly. "Well, maybe this is one of those moments. Maybe being willing to share our story, to admit we don't have all the answers, to accept help from people who understand our struggles, maybe that takes a different kind of courage, but courage nonetheless." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. I could see my father weighing his options, fighting against a lifetime of emotional self-reliance and the military culture that had taught him to soldier on regardless of personal cost. "All right," he said finally. "All right, let's try it. If Mickey thinks it might help, and if you're willing to give it a shot, then I guess I can too." Dr. Torres smiled with genuine warmth. "I think you'll be surprised by how much you both have to offer the group, not just how much you might gain from it. Your experiences, both the trauma and the healing journey you're beginning, could provide hope and guidance for others who are struggling with similar challenges." The idea that our pain might somehow become a source of healing for others was both humbling and empowering. It suggested that even our worst experiences could have meaning and purpose if we were willing to transform them into wisdom and compassion. "When would we start?" I asked. "The group meets twice a week, Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings. Once you're settled in Houston and have had a chance to begin your medical treatment, Elena can introduce you to some of the members individually before bringing you to a full group meeting." "Elena sounds like an incredible person," I said. "She is," Dr. Torres replied with obvious love and pride. "She's the one who taught me that healing happens in relationship, not just the relationship between doctor and patient, but the relationships we build with family, friends, and community. Medicine can address the physical aspects of trauma, but it's human connection that heals the soul." As if summoned by our conversation about the importance of human connection, there was another knock on the door. Dr. Patel entered, looking pleased and carrying what appeared to be test results. "I apologize for interrupting," he said, "but I have some rather exciting news that I thought you'd all want to hear immediately." "What kind of news?" I asked, my heart racing. "The latest imaging studies show that the swelling around the damaged nerve has decreased significantly more than we expected. Combined with the improved nerve conduction studies Maggie mentioned earlier, I'm cautiously optimistic that you may recover more function than we initially projected." "How much more function?" my father asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Potentially full recovery," Dr. Patel replied, unable to suppress his excitement. "Obviously, there are no guarantees, and it will require intensive rehabilitation and possibly some surgical intervention. But for the first time since your accident, I feel comfortable saying that a return to full military duty is a realistic possibility." The room erupted in celebration, with everyone talking at once and tears flowing freely. I felt as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted from my chest. The future, which had seemed so bleak and limited just hours earlier, suddenly blazed with possibility. "Dr. Patel," Dr. Torres said, stepping forward, "I've been discussing the possibility of Serafina transferring to Houston Methodist for her continued care. Given these new developments, I think the resources we have available there could maximize her chances of full recovery." Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "I've heard excellent things about your rehabilitation programs. If Serafina is agreeable to the transfer, I think it could be the best possible next step in her treatment." "I'm more than agreeable," I said emphatically. "Dr. Torres, when can we make this happen?" "I'll start making calls this afternoon," he replied. "With any luck, we can have you transferred by early next week." As the medical professionals began discussing the logistics of my transfer and treatment plan, I found myself looking around the room at the faces of the people who had become my extended family over these past weeks. My father, transformed from the distant, emotionally unavailable man I'd grown up with into someone willing to take risks and fight for our relationship. Maggie, the angel who had appeared at exactly the right moment to help us both understand that heroism comes in many forms and that healing is always possible, even after decades of pain. Dr. Torres, living proof that trauma can be transformed into purpose and that the acts of courage we perform ripple forward through time in ways we can never fully comprehend. "There's something I need to say to all of you," I announced, causing the conversation to pause. "A month ago, when I woke up in this hospital bed, I thought my life was over. I thought I was broken beyond repair, abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me, facing a future that held nothing but limitations and regret." I paused, gathering my thoughts and my courage.
But sitting here now, surrounded by people who have shown me what real strength looks like, what genuine love and support can accomplish, what healing is actually possible when we're willing to face our fears and embrace change, I realize that my accident wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a completely different story, one that I never could have imagined, but that might turn out to be better than anything I'd originally planned. My father reached out and took my hand, his grip strong and steady. "Sarah, I need to apologize to you, not just for not being here when you were hurt, but for all the years I wasn't really present, even when I was physically in the same room. I thought I was protecting you from my pain, but I was really just being a coward." "Dad, let me finish," he said gently. Meeting Mickey again, hearing about the life he built, understanding how my actions in Vietnam affected not just him, but everyone he's gone on to help, it's made me realize that running away from connection doesn't protect anyone. It just ensures that whatever good we might do, whatever healing we might facilitate, never has the chance to happen. Dr. Torres nodded in understanding. "That's one of the most important lessons I learned in that support group I mentioned. Our pain doesn't just affect us. It affects everyone around us, sometimes for generations. But so does our healing. When we do the hard work of confronting our trauma and building healthier relationships, we're not just helping ourselves, we're creating a legacy of resilience that can inspire and strengthen others for years to come." "Is that what you think happened here?" I asked. "Your healing, creating a legacy that eventually helped me and my father?" "I think what happened here is that a circle finally closed," he replied thoughtfully. "Your father saved my life, which allowed me to become a doctor and help save other lives. One of those other lives belonged to a nurse who happened to recognize your name and understand the significance of your father's service. That nurse was able to facilitate a reunion that wouldn't have happened otherwise, which in turn gives me the opportunity to offer you the kind of advanced medical care that might restore your military career." "You make it sound almost mystical," Maggie said with a smile. "Maybe it is," Dr. Torres replied. "Or maybe it's just what happens when people choose love over fear, connection over isolation, action over paralysis. Maybe this is what the world looks like when we stop running from our pain and start transforming it into purpose." As the afternoon wore on and the various logistical details of my transfer were arranged, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought us all together. A car accident that had seemed like pure tragedy had become the catalyst for healing relationships, reconnecting with lost family, and opening doors to possibilities I'd never considered. My father, who had been trapped for decades in a prison of guilt and grief, had found his way back to the courage and compassion that had once defined him. Dr. Torres, whose life had been saved by my father's heroism, was now positioned to potentially save my military career and help both of us continue our own healing journeys. Maggie, whose brother's death had left her searching for meaning and purpose, had found a way to honor his memory by caring for the daughter of the man who had tried to save him. None of it made logical sense. The coincidences were too numerous, the timing too perfect, the connections too meaningful to be explained by chance alone. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps healing doesn't follow the rules of logic and probability.
Perhaps it follows the rules of love and courage and the willingness to believe that even our deepest wounds can become sources of wisdom and strength. There's one more thing I want to discuss before we finalize these plans, I said as the afternoon began to turn toward evening. Dr. Torres, you mentioned that the people in your support group have found ways to transform their trauma into purpose. I've been thinking about what that might look like for me, regardless of whether I'm able to return to active military duty. What have you been thinking? He asked. About becoming a counselor or therapist specializing in helping military families deal with trauma and recovery. About using my own experience of injury and healing to help other people navigate similar challenges. About finding ways to serve my country and my community, even if that service looks different than I originally planned. The idea had been forming in the back of my mind for days, but speaking it out loud gave it weight and reality. I could see myself working with families like mine, helping bridge the gaps that trauma can create between people who love each other but don't know how to communicate across the chasm of pain and fear. My father squeezed my hand. That sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. You've always had a gift for seeing the best in people, for believing in healing even when the situation seemed hopeless. I learned that from you, I replied. Not from what you said, but from what you did. You saved Dr. Torres's life when it would have been easier and safer to stay in cover. You raised me to believe in service and sacrifice and the importance of fighting for what matters, even when your own heart was breaking. And you, Maggie added, showed both of your father and me that forgiveness is possible, that relationships can be rebuilt even after years of distance and misunderstanding, that it's never too late to choose connection over isolation. As the sun set outside my hospital window, casting long shadows across the room that had witnessed so much pain and so much healing, I felt a sense of completion settling over me. Not the completion that comes from reaching an endpoint, but the satisfaction that comes from understanding that every ending is also a beginning, that every closed door opens onto new possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The transfer to Houston, the intensive medical treatment, the hard work of physical and emotional rehabilitation, the uncertainty of whether I would ultimately be able to return to military service. There would be setbacks and frustrations, moments of doubt and fear, times when the old patterns of withdrawal and self-protection would reassert themselves. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to transform their pain into purpose, their trauma into wisdom, their isolation into connection, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: genuine hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope that fears disappointment, but the deep, sustainable hope that comes from understanding that healing is always possible, that love is stronger than fear, and that sometimes our greatest disasters really do become doorways to our greatest opportunities. The fluorescent lights above me. 6 months later, I stood in the courtyard of Houston Methodist Hospital, my legs steady beneath me for the first time since the accident. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, but I welcomed its warmth after so many months of sterile hospital corridors and air-conditioned rehabilitation centers. Today marked a milestone I hadn't dared to dream of during those dark early weeks. I was walking without assistance, my nerve function restored to nearly 90% of normal capacity. The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. The transfer to Houston had brought its own set of challenges, from adjusting to new medical protocols to navigating the complex dynamics of Dr. Torres and Elena's household. Elena had proven to be everything her husband had promised and more, a fierce advocate with an intuitive understanding of trauma's lasting effects on both patients and their families. My father had surprised everyone, myself included, with his resilience during the transition. The man who had once viewed change as a threat to be avoided had embraced the upheaval with something approaching enthusiasm. He'd thrown himself into the support group meetings with an intensity that sometimes worried me, as if he were trying to make up for decades of emotional avoidance all at once. The group sessions had been revelatory in ways I hadn't anticipated. Listening to other veterans share their stories had given both my father and me a broader perspective on trauma and recovery. We learned that healing isn't a linear process, that setbacks are normal rather than failures, and that the goal isn't to return to who you were before, but to integrate your experiences into a stronger, more compassionate version of yourself. Maria, the former Navy corpsman turned physical therapist, had become an unexpected mentor. Her no-nonsense approach to rehabilitation, combined with genuine empathy for the emotional challenges of recovery, had pushed me harder than I thought possible. Under her guidance, I'd progressed from basic mobility exercises to advanced strength training, each session building not just physical capacity but mental resilience. Robert, the Air Force pilot turned counselor, had worked extensively with my father on processing his Vietnam experiences. Their sessions often ran long, two men who'd served in different wars, finding common ground in shared understanding of combat psychological toll. Through their work together, my father had begun to separate his identity from his trauma, recognizing that his experiences in war were part of his story but didn't have to define his entire narrative. Jennifer, the former Army medic pursuing medical school, had become something of a kindred spirit. Like me, she was navigating the challenge of potentially returning to military service while also exploring alternative paths that might better serve her evolving understanding of what it meant to help others. Our conversations had helped crystallize my growing interest in trauma counseling, particularly working with military families, struggling to rebuild connections damaged by deployment, injury, or the invisible wounds of service. The medical aspect of my recovery had progressed beyond even Dr. Torres's optimistic projections. The experimental nerve regeneration therapy had exceeded expectations, and the advanced physical rehabilitation program had restored function I'd feared was lost forever. More importantly, the comprehensive approach that addressed both physical and psychological healing had given me tools for managing not just my current recovery, but any future challenges life might present. Today's appointment was different from the routine checkups that had marked my progress over the past months. Dr. Torres had requested a comprehensive evaluation by a military medical board to determine my fitness for return to active duty. The results would determine whether my original dream of overseas deployment remained viable or whether I needed to fully commit to the alternative path I'd been exploring. As I made my way through the hospital corridors,
The scared, angry young woman who'd felt abandoned and hopeless bore little resemblance to the person I'd become through this journey of healing and rediscovery. The waiting area outside Dr. Torres's office was familiar territory by now, but today it felt different. My father sat beside me, no longer the withdrawn, guilt-ridden man who'd burst through my hospital room door all those months ago. The support group work had helped him process decades of unaddressed trauma, and while he still carried scars from his service, they no longer controlled his ability to connect with others. Maggie had made good on her promise to support us through the transition. Her temporary assignment at Houston Methodist had become permanent after she'd fallen in love with the hospital's veteran rehabilitation program. She'd become an integral part of the treatment team, her unique combination of clinical expertise and personal understanding of military families making her invaluable to patients struggling with similar challenges. Serafina O'Brien? A nurse I didn't recognize called my name, and I realized with a start that this was it, the moment that would determine the direction of my future. My father squeezed my hand as I stood, his touch conveying both support and confidence in my ability to handle whatever news awaited. Dr. Torres's office had become a second home over these months, but today it was crowded with unfamiliar faces. The military medical board consisted of 3 officers, their uniforms pressed and expressions professional but not unkind. Dr. Torres stood behind his desk, his usual warm demeanor replaced by the gravity appropriate to the occasion. Lieutenant O'Brien, the senior officer, a colonel whose nameplate read Harrison, addressed me formally. "Please have a seat. We're here to review your medical records and evaluate your fitness for return to active duty." I settled into the chair across from the board, my heart pounding but my voice steady as I responded. "Yes, sir, I understand." Colonel Harrison opened a thick file that I recognized as containing months of medical records, test results, and evaluation reports. "Your recovery has been remarkable, Lieutenant. Dr. Torres speaks very highly of your progress, both physically and psychologically. However, as you know, military service, particularly overseas deployment, requires not just recovery, but peak physical and mental fitness." "I understand, sir. I believe I've achieved that standard." "Let's review the specifics," another board member, Major Chen, interjected. She consulted her own set of documents before continuing. "Your nerve function tests show 92% restoration, which exceeds the minimum threshold for active duty. Your physical fitness evaluations demonstrate performance within normal ranges for your age and military occupation specialty. Your psychological evaluations indicate successful processing of trauma and strong coping mechanisms. I felt a flutter of hope but forced myself to remain composed. Military medical boards were notorious for their cautious approach to clearance decisions, particularly for service members who'd sustained significant injuries. However, Colonel Harrison continued, and my heart sank at the word, there are some concerns we need to address. Your injury was severe, and while your recovery has been exceptional, there's always the possibility of setbacks or complications, particularly under the stress conditions you might encounter in a deployment environment. Dr. Torres stepped forward. Colonel, if I may, Lieutenant O'Brien has been subjected to stress testing that simulates deployment conditions. Her performance has been consistently within acceptable parameters, and her pain management strategies are well established and effective. Dr. Torres, we appreciate your advocacy for your patient, but our responsibility extends beyond current capabilities to long-term sustainability and mission readiness. Major Chen's tone was respectful but firm. We need to consider not just whether Lieutenant O'Brien can perform her duties today, but whether she can maintain that performance over an extended deployment period. The third board member, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he leaned forward with obvious interest. Lieutenant O'Brien, I've been reviewing your file, and I'm struck by something beyond your medical recovery. You've been exploring alternative career paths during your rehabilitation, including trauma counseling and veteran support services. Can you tell us about that? The question caught me off guard. I'd expected the evaluation to focus solely on my physical and psychological fitness for military service, not my broader career interests. Yes, sir. During my recovery, I've become interested in helping other military families navigate the challenges of trauma and healing. I've been exploring educational opportunities that might allow me to specialize in that area. And how does that interest relate to your desire to return to active duty? I paused, considering how to answer honestly without appearing uncommitted to military service. Sir, my experiences over the past year have given me a broader understanding of what it means to serve. I believe there are many ways to contribute to our military community, whether that's through traditional deployment roles or through specialized support services that help our service members and their families maintain resilience and readiness. Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with his colleagues before addressing me again. Lieutenant O'Brien, based on our review of your medical records and evaluation of your current fitness, this board finds you medically qualified for return to full active duty, including overseas deployment. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but before I could respond, he continued. However, we'd like to propose an alternative assignment that might better utilize your unique qualifications and interests while still fulfilling your service obligations. What kind of alternative assignment, sir? Major Chen took over the explanation. The Army is developing a new program focused on family resilience and trauma recovery. Given your personal experience with injury, recovery, and family healing, combined with your expressed interest in counseling and veteran support, you would be an ideal candidate to help develop and implement this program. The position would require additional training in counseling and psychology, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez added, but it would allow you to serve in a capacity that draws on both your military experience and your recovery journey. You'd be working directly with military families facing challenges similar to what you and your father have navigated. I felt stunned by the unexpected offer. It seemed to bridge the gap between my original military aspirations and the new interests that had emerged during my recovery. Would this be a temporary assignment or a permanent career path? That would depend on your performance and the program's success, Colonel Harrison replied. But we're looking at this as a long-term initiative. There's growing recognition that our military families need more comprehensive support systems, and officers with first-hand experience of trauma and recovery are uniquely qualified to provide that support. Dr. Torres stepped forward again. Colonel, if I may, this seems like an ideal match between Lieutenant O'Brien's capabilities and the military's needs. Her recovery has been remarkable, not just medically, but holistically, and she's demonstrated exceptional insight into the healing process. What would be the timeline for this program? I asked, my mind racing for the implications of this unexpected opportunity. The initial training phase would begin in 6 months, allowing you time to complete your current recovery protocols and perhaps begin some preliminary coursework in psychology or counseling, Major Chen explained. The program itself would launch approximately 1 year from now, with you as one of the primary implementation officers.
I looked at my father, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, but whose expression conveyed pride and encouragement. This opportunity seemed to represent everything we'd learned about transforming trauma into purpose, about finding ways to serve that drew on their deepest experiences of pain and healing. Sir, I'm honored by this offer and very interested in the program. May I have some time to consider it fully? Of course, we understand this represents a significant career decision. Take 2 weeks to consider your options, discuss it with your family and advisors, and let us know your decision. After the board members left, Dr. Torres closed the door and turned to face me with a broad smile. Serafina, that was extraordinary. I've never seen a medical board offer such a unique opportunity to a recovering service member. Do you think it's a good fit? I asked, still processing the unexpected turn the meeting had taken. I think it's perfect, he replied without hesitation. It allows you to continue your military service while pursuing your passion for helping others heal from trauma. More importantly, it positions you to make a lasting impact on military families facing challenges you understand intimately. My father had remained unusually quiet, and I turned to him with concern.
Dad, what do you think? You haven't said anything. He was silent for another moment, his eyes distant with what I'd learned to recognize as deep thought rather than withdrawal. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I think your mother would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become and the path you're choosing. This program, this opportunity to help other families heal, it's exactly the kind of service she always believed in. Not just serving your country, but serving humanity's deepest needs for connection and healing. Are you sure? I know you were proud of my original military plans, the idea of me following in your footsteps with overseas deployment. Sarah, what you're being offered is a chance to follow in my footsteps in the way that matters most. Not by repeating my experiences, but by taking the lessons learned from those experiences and using them to prevent other families from going through what we went through. That's not just service, that's wisdom in action. Dr. Torres nodded in agreement. Your father's right. The program you're being offered represents a new understanding of military readiness that includes emotional and psychological resilience, not just physical and tactical capabilities. You'd be helping to build a stronger, more sustainable military community. Over the following days, I found myself discussing the opportunity with everyone in my support network. Elena was enthusiastic, drawing parallels between the proposed program and her own work with veteran families. She offered to connect me with educational resources and professional development opportunities that could enhance my preparation for the role. Maria, my physical therapist mentor, was particularly excited about the program's potential. Military families need advocates who understand both the medical and emotional challenges of recovery, she told me during one of our sessions. You'd be uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between clinical treatment and practical family support. Robert, who had worked extensively with my father, offered insights into the program's potential impact from a counselor's perspective. The military has historically been reluctant to address psychological trauma comprehensively, he explained. A program led by officers who've experienced and overcome such trauma could revolutionize how the military approaches mental health and family resilience. Jennifer, my fellow medical school aspirant turned military family advocate, was the most enthusiastic supporter. This is exactly what the military needs, she insisted. Officers who can speak from experience about injury, recovery, family healing, people who understand these challenges from the inside rather than just from textbooks and training manuals. But it was a conversation with Maggie that ultimately crystallized my decision. We were sitting in the hospital cafeteria during one of her breaks, the familiar institutional surroundings providing a comfortable backdrop for serious discussion. You know, she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, when I first walked into your room and realized who you were, I thought the story was about completing a circle. Your father saved Danny, and now I was in a position to help save you. But I think I was seeing it too narrowly. What do you mean? I mean, the circle is much bigger than I originally understood. Your father's act of courage in Vietnam didn't just save Danny. It started a ripple effect that's still spreading. Danny's letters home gave our family hope during dark times. My decision to become a nurse was partly inspired by wanting to help people the way the medical team helped Danny. My specialization in veteran care was directly motivated by wanting to honor his memory. She paused to take a sip of coffee before continuing.
But now you have the opportunity to expand that ripple even further. The program you're being offered could help hundreds, maybe thousands of military families. Your father's moment of courage 50 years ago could ultimately impact generations of service members and their loved ones. You really think the impact could be that significant? I think trauma and healing work exactly like courage. They ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict or measure. Every person you help heal becomes capable of helping others heal. Every family you help reconnect becomes a source of strength for other families facing similar challenges. That evening, I called Colonel Harrison to accept the position. The certainty in my voice surprised even me as I committed to this new path that seemed to emerge organically from everything I'd experienced over the past year. The remaining months of my recovery took on a different quality once the decision was made. Instead of simply working toward physical and emotional healing, I was now preparing for a role that would require me to guide others through similar journeys. Dr. Torres connected me with additional resources on trauma counseling. Elena helped me identify relevant coursework in psychology and family systems, and the support group members shared insights into effective approaches to healing and resilience. My relationship with my father continued to evolve as we both prepared for this next phase. He'd decided to relocate permanently to Houston, partly to remain close to the medical team that had facilitated both of our healing journeys, but primarily because he'd found purpose in his own work with veteran support organizations. The man who had once isolated himself from human connection had become an advocate for other veterans struggling with trauma and family relationships. On my final day as a patient at Houston Methodist, I found myself back in the courtyard where I'd stood 6 months earlier, marveling at my restored ability to walk. But now, the physical healing felt like the least significant aspect of the transformation I'd undergone. The scared, angry young woman who'd been brought here broken in body and spirit had become someone capable of helping others navigate their own journeys from trauma to healing. Dr. Torres joined me in the courtyard as I prepared to leave for my new assignment and the beginning of the Family Resilience Program. "Any second thoughts about the path you've chosen?" he asked. "None at all," I replied with complete honesty. "This feels like exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. Not what I planned, but what I'm called to do." "That's the difference between a job and a vocation," he observed. "A job is something you do to earn a living. A vocation is something you're uniquely qualified to do because of who you are and what you've experienced." "Is that how you felt about becoming a surgeon?" "Absolutely. My injury in Vietnam could have been just a tragedy, a random piece of bad luck that derailed my life. Instead, it became the foundation for a career that's allowed me to help thousands of people, not despite my trauma, but because of it." As we walked back toward the hospital entrance, I thought about the long chain of events that had brought me to this moment. My accident, as devastating as it had seemed at the time, had created the conditions for healing relationships, discovering new purposes, and finding ways to serve that I never could have imagined in my original life plan. My father was waiting by the entrance, no longer the broken, withdrawn man who'd been afraid to visit his injured daughter, but someone who'd rediscovered his capacity for courage, love, and service. Beside him stood Maggie, whose chance recognition of my name had set in motion the series of revelations and reconnections that had transformed all of our lives. "Ready for the next adventure?" my father asked as I approached. "More than ready," I replied, and meant it completely. As we drove away from Houston Methodist toward my new assignment and the beginning of the Family Resilience Program, I reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed our individual traumas into collective wisdom, our personal healing into a resource for helping others. The accident that had threatened to end my military career had instead revealed a form of service more aligned with my deepest values than anything I'd originally planned. 6 months later, I stood before my first group of military families participating in the pilot Family Resilience Program. The faces looking back at me reflected the same mixture of pain, hope, fear, and determination I'd seen in my own mirror during those early days of recovery. But now I had something to offer them beyond sympathy. I had proof that healing was possible, that relationships could be rebuilt, that trauma could be transformed into wisdom and strength. Dr. Torres joined me in the courtyard as I prepared to leave for my new assignment and the beginning of the Family Resilience Program. "Any second thoughts about the path you've chosen?" he asked. "None at all," I replied with complete honesty. "This feels like exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. Not what I planned, but what I'm called to do." "That's the difference between a job and a vocation," he observed. "A job is something you do to earn a living. A vocation is something you're uniquely qualified to do because of who you are and what you've experienced. Is that how you felt about becoming a surgeon? Absolutely. My injury in Vietnam could have been just a tragedy, a random piece of bad luck that derailed my life. Instead, it became the foundation for a career that's allowed me to help thousands of people, not despite my trauma, but because of it. As we walked back toward the hospital entrance, I thought about the long chain of events that had brought me to this moment. My accident, as devastating as it had seemed at the time, had created the conditions for healing relationships, discovering new purposes, and finding ways to serve that I never could have imagined in my original life plan. My father was waiting by the entrance, no longer the broken, withdrawn man who'd been afraid to visit his injured daughter, but someone who'd rediscovered his capacity for courage, love, and service. Beside him stood Maggie, whose chance recognition of my name had set in motion the series of revelations and reconnections that had transformed all of our lives. "Ready for the next adventure?" my father asked as I approached. "More than ready," I replied, and meant it completely. As we drove away from Houston Methodist toward my new assignment and the beginning of the Family Resilience Program, I reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed our individual traumas into collective wisdom, our personal healing into a resource for helping others. The accident that had threatened to end my military career had instead revealed a form of service more aligned with my deepest values than anything I'd originally planned. 6 months later, I stood before my first group of military families participating in the pilot Family Resilience Program. The faces looking back at me reflected the same mixture of pain, hope, fear, and determination I'd seen in my own mirror during those early days of recovery. But now I had something to offer them beyond sympathy. I had proof that healing was possible, that relationships could be rebuilt, that trauma could be transformed into wisdom and strength. "My name is Lieutenant Serafina O'Brien," I began, my voice steady and sure, "and I want to tell you about the day I thought my life was over, and how that day became the beginning of